I was transported to the land of Oz. Glinda is not the good witch. I was 14 the first time I went to Oz. It didn't happen because of a tornado or a pair of magic shoes. No, I got there by accident. I was walking home from school on a gloomy autumn afternoon, my head down, kicking at leaves, when I stepped into a puddle. The next thing I knew, I was lying in the middle of a field of red poppies. At first, I thought it was a dream. Everything was too bright, too vivid. The sky was an impossible blue. The flowers glistened as if they'd been polished, and the air smelled like sugar and citrus. But when the Munchkins arrived, tiny people in colorful clothes, bowing and clapping, I realized this was something else entirely. And then I met her, Glinda. She appeared in a shimmering pink bubble, floating down from the sky like some kind of angel. Her dress sparkled, her golden hair framed her face like a halo, and her smile could have lit up the entire field. "Welcome," she said, her voice like honey. "You've come to the land of Oz, dear boy, and you're safe now." Safe. That word meant everything to a kid like me, who spent most of his time trying to dodge bullies at school and arguments at home. Glinda made me feel special, important, like I mattered in a way I never had before. The week I spent in Oz was the best of my life. Glinda showed me the Emerald City, a place of gleaming towers and streets paved with gold. She threw a feast in my honor, with tables piled high with food I couldn't even name. And she told me stories about the Wicked Witch of the West, a cruel tyrant who had terrorized Oz until she was finally defeated. "You're lucky you came to us now," Glinda said, her smile warm and kind. "Oz is at peace, and you're welcome here for as long as you like." But one morning, I woke up back in Kansas, lying on the cold, cracked pavement where I'd fallen. My trip to Oz felt like a dream I couldn't shake, and for years, I wondered if it had been real at all. I found out the answer when I went back. I was 24, working a dead-end job and living in a dingy apartment when it happened. I was walking home late at night, the streets deserted, when I turned a corner and saw a strange light. It was faint at first, but as I got closer, it grew brighter and brighter until it swallowed me whole. When I opened my eyes, I was back in Oz, but it wasn't the Oz I remembered. The sky was dark and heavy with clouds. The once brilliant towers of the Emerald City were crumbling, their green glow faded to a sickly yellow. The fields were brown and dead, the air thick with a metallic stench. And then there was Glinda. She stood at the gates of the Emerald City, waiting for me. Her dress was still pink, but it was stained and tattered. Her golden hair hung limp, and her face, her once beautiful face, was twisted with something I can only describe as rage. "You," she said, her voice low and venomous, "you've returned." "I didn't mean to," I stammered, but she ignored me. "Do you know what you left behind?" she hissed, taking a step closer. "Do you know what I've had to do to keep this place together after you abandoned it?" "I didn't abandon anything," I protested. "You sent me back." She laughed then, a sharp, bitter sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "I sent you back because you were useless to me then, but now I think you'll be very useful indeed." I tried to run, but she raised her hand and I froze. I don't know if it was magic or fear or both, but I couldn't move. She led me through the ruins of the Emerald City, and as we walked, she told me what had happened. Without the Wicked Witch to unite them, the people of Oz had turned on each other. The factions that had once fought against evil now fought each other. Glinda had tried to bring order, but it had cost her. "I had to make hard choices," she said, her voice sharp and unyielding. Sacrifices, for the greater good. That's when I saw them. People, thin, pale, and trembling, shuffling through the streets in chains. They carried heavy loads, their shoulders hunched under the weight, their faces blank and hollow. "What are you doing to them?" I whispered. "Keeping Oz alive," she said simply. "You're enslaving them." Her eyes flashed, and for a moment, I thought she might strike me. Instead, she smiled, a cold, cruel smile that made my stomach turn. "They're citizens," she said, "and they're grateful. Without me, they'd have nothing. Without me, there'd be chaos." She reached out and grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "You left once, but you won't leave again. Oz needs you, whether you like it or not." I stared at her, horrified, and in that moment, I realized something. Glinda wasn't the good witch. Maybe she never had been. I yanked my arm back, stumbling away from her. My heart pounded in my chest, and my legs felt like they could give out at any second. But I couldn't stay near her. I couldn't stay in the Emerald City. "Where do you think you're going?" Glinda's voice rang out, sharp and mocking. I didn't answer. I just ran. The streets were a maze of rubble and shadows, but I didn't care where I was going as long as it was far away from her. The sound of my own panicked breathing filled my ears, but it couldn't drown out Glinda's words echoing in my head. "Oz needs you. I wasn't a hero. I wasn't even special. What could I possibly do for Oz?" I didn't stop running until I reached the outskirts of the city, where the golden streets turned to dirt paths and the air smelled less like rot and more like wet earth. My legs burned, and my lungs felt like they were on fire. But I didn't stop until I was sure she wasn't following me. It was quiet out here, almost peaceful, but it was a false peace. Even in the distance, I could hear the faint clinking of chains and the murmur of voices. I didn't know what to do. I thought about trying to leave Oz again, but how? Last time, I'd just woken up back in Kansas, but now it felt like I was trapped. And then I heard it, a voice, soft and cautious, calling out to me from the shadows. "You're him, aren't you?" I turned, my heart leaping into my throat. A woman stepped out from behind a tree. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with dark hair that hung in loose waves around her face. Her clothes were plain, patched together from scraps, and she looked like she hadn't eaten in days. "Him?" I asked, taking a step back. "The one who left. The boy from another world." I swallowed hard. "How do you know that?" She tilted her head, studying me. "Everyone knows. Glinda made sure of it. She told us how you came here, how you abandoned us when we needed you most. You're the reason she became this." "I didn't abandon anyone," I said, my voice rising. "She sent me back. I didn't have a choice." The woman's eyes narrowed. "She says a lot of things, but we know better." "We?" She glanced over her shoulder, as if checking to make sure no one was listening, then motioned for me to follow her. I hesitated. Trusting strangers in a world like this didn't seem like a great idea, but what choice did I have? Glinda was hunting me, and staying alone wasn't an option. The woman led me into the woods, where the trees grew thick and twisted, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the light. After what felt like hours, we arrived at a small clearing. A group of people, men, women, and even children, were gathered around a weak, flickering fire. They were gaunt and tired, their clothes tattered, but their eyes burned with a quiet determination. "Who's this?" a man asked, his voice gruff. "The one from the other world," the woman said. The group fell silent, their eyes locking onto me. I shifted uncomfortably under their gaze. I'm nobody, I said. Just someone who got dragged here by accident. That's what Glinda says, the man muttered. I bristled. Why does everyone keep acting like I owe her something? I didn't ask to come here. I didn't ask for any of this. She's twisted the truth, the woman said softly. She uses your name to keep people in line, to justify everything she does. She tells them you abandoned us, that she had no choice but to take control. But we know the truth. I frowned. What truth? That she was always like this, the man said, his voice bitter. The good witch. There was never such a thing. She was just waiting for her moment, for a chance to take power. Elphaba kept her in check, but once the Wicked Witch was gone, there was no one left to stop her. The name hit me like a slap. Elphaba, the Wicked Witch. I'd only ever heard her called that before. She wasn't wicked, the woman said, as if reading my thoughts. She was flawed, yes, but she fought for Oz, for us. Glinda only fights for herself. I sat down, the weight of their words sinking in. Everything I thought I knew about Oz, about Glinda, was a lie. What do you want from me? I asked. The woman knelt in front of me, her eyes pleading. We want you to help us fight. Fight Glinda? Yes, she said. You've been to the other world. You've seen what it's like. You know things we don't. And Glinda fears you. That's why she's so desperate to control the story about you. I shook my head. I'm not a hero. I don't even know why I'm here. Maybe not, she said, her voice steady. But you're here now, and that means something. I wanted to argue, to tell them they'd picked the wrong guy. But deep down, I knew there was no going back. Glinda wouldn't stop until she had me. And these people, these rebels, they were my only chance. For better or worse, I was part of this now. And if Glinda wanted me to be her enemy, then that's exactly what I'd become. The rebels didn't waste any time pulling me into their world. They gave me food, hard bread and watery stew, and let me sleep by the fire that night. It wasn't much, but it was more than I'd expected from a group of strangers. The next morning, they started filling me in on their plans. Glinda's power is built on fear, the woman, whose name I learned was Keller, said as we sat around the dying embers of the fire. She uses her magic to keep people in line, but it's her army of enforcers that really keeps the Emerald City in check. They're like her personal guards, another man, Aaron, added. They patrol the city, round up anyone who steps out of line, and take them to the castle. No one comes back. I shivered at his words. What happens to them? Keller shook her head. We don't know. Some say she turns them into her mindless servants. Others say she drains their life to fuel her magic. Either way, it's bad, Aaron said, his voice grim. The more I learned, the more hopeless it all seemed. Glinda had an iron grip on Oz, and the rebels were barely scraping by. They didn't have weapons, magic, or numbers on their side. All they had was a fierce determination to see her fall. And me. We need to spread the truth about Glinda, Keller said later that day as she led me through the forest. If people knew what she really is, they might rise up against her. How do you plan to do that? I asked. She stopped and turned to face me, her expression serious. You're the one thing Glinda can't control, the boy from another world. You've seen the cracks in her facade, and if you speak out, people will listen. I stared at her, disbelief flooding my chest. You think I'm some kind of savior? I'm not. I can't fight her. I can't even fight my way out of a bad job interview. You don't have to fight her, Keller said, her voice calm but firm. You just have to be a symbol, a spark. The rest of us will do the fighting. It was a lot to take in. Too much, really. But as much as I wanted to walk away, I couldn't ignore the desperation in their eyes. These people believed in me, even if I didn't believe it in myself. That night, as I lay under the stars, I thought about the Oz I'd seen as a kid. The glittering Emerald City, the laughing munchkins, the perfect smile of the good witch. It was all a lie. The real Oz was broken, suffering, and terrified. And I was here. For a reason, or by accident, it didn't matter. I was here, and I couldn't just sit by and do nothing. The next morning, I told Keller I was in. She smiled, a real smile, not the twisted mockery that Glinda wore. Good. There's someone you need to meet. Who? I asked. Keller's expression turned serious. The Scarecrow. I blinked. The Scarecrow. I thought he left. She finished for me. He did. After the wizard disappeared and Glinda took over, he tried to stand up to her. She burned his fields and scattered his allies. But he's still out there, somewhere in the West. If anyone knows how to take her down, it's him. The Scarecrow. I remembered him from the stories Glinda told me when I was a kid, the wise, kind ruler of the Emerald City after the wizard left. He'd been one of the heroes who helped Dorothy defeat the Wicked Witch. And now he was hiding, just like the rest of us. The journey west was long and dangerous. The forest thinned out, giving way to rolling hills and barren plains. We moved mostly at night to avoid Glinda's patrols, but even then, it wasn't safe. One evening, as we were crossing a shallow river, we heard the distant sound of hooves. Keller yanked me into the shadows, her hand clamped over my mouth to keep me quiet. A group of enforcers rode past us, their faces hidden behind metal masks. They carried spears and wore black armor that gleamed in the moonlight. They're hunting someone, Keller whispered once they were gone. Us? I asked, my voice barely audible. She shook her head. Not yet. We found the Scarecrow 2 days later, in a burned-out village near the edge of the desert. At first, I didn't recognize him. His straw stuffing was dirty and ragged. His clothes were patched with scraps of fabric, and his hat was missing. But his eyes, sharp and calculating, gave him away. I heard rumors about you, he said, his voice low and tired as he studied me. The boy from another world, Glinda's bogeyman. I'm not a bogeyman, I said defensively. He chuckled, a dry sound that carried no real humor. Not yet, but give her time. She'll twist your name into something useful for her. He wasn't what I'd expected. He was angry, bitter, and more than a little jaded. But he knew Glinda better than anyone, and as he spoke about her rise to power, I realized just how dangerous she really was. She doesn't just want control of Oz, the Scarecrow said, his eyes narrowing. She wants control of everything. The magic, the people, even the land itself. And she won't stop until she has it. Then how do we stop her? I asked. The Scarecrow leaned back, his gaze piercing. You don't. Not directly. But there's a way to tip the balance, if you're willing to risk everything. What way? He smiled, but it was a grim, joyless thing. You'll see soon enough. But I'll warn you now, once you take this path, there's no going back. I thought of Glinda's sneer, the chains in the Emerald City, and the hollow-eyed citizens too afraid to fight back. I wasn't planning on going back anyway, I said. The Scarecrow's plan, if you could even call it that, was less of a strategy and more of a gamble. He didn't believe in a direct fight against Glinda, not with her magic and her army. Instead, he wanted to disrupt the source of her power. It's her connection to the Emerald City, he explained, as we sat around a campfire that night. The city is a focal point for magic in Oz. Whoever controls it, controls the land. The throne isn't just a symbol, it's a conduit. If we can sever her connection to it, We can weaken her enough to take her down. And how do we do that? I asked, trying to keep the skepticism out of my voice. The scarecrow turned to me, his straw-filled face unreadable in the firelight. There's a relic, an artifact older than Oz itself, hidden in the ruins of the Wicked Witch's castle. It's said to nullify magic, to strip even the most powerful sorcerer of their strength. My stomach churned at the mention of the Wicked Witch. I'd seen her castle once during my first trip to Oz, a black, jagged fortress that loomed over the western mountains like a curse made solid. Even then, it had radiated menace. "Let me guess," I said. "You want me to go get it?" The scarecrow nodded. "You're the only one who can. Glinda's forces are watching every major route, but they won't be expecting you. You're an unknown variable, and that makes you dangerous." Keller chimed in. "We'll help you get there, but once you're inside, you'll be on your own. The magic around the castle is unpredictable. It reacts to fear, to doubt. If you're not careful, it could destroy you before you even reach the artifact." "Great," I muttered. "No pressure." We set out the next morning. The scarecrow stayed behind, claiming he was too conspicuous to travel openly. That left me with Keller and two others from the rebel camp, a wiry man named Jack and a quiet girl named Mira. The journey to the witch's castle was even worse than I'd imagined. The air grew colder the closer we got, and the landscape turned harsh and unforgiving. The mountains were steep and treacherous, the wind howling through the jagged peaks like a living thing. The castle itself came into view on the third day, a towering black silhouette against the grey sky. It was even more ominous up close, its spires twisting unnaturally as if they were reaching for something unseen. "This is as far as we go," Keller said, stopping at the edge of the dead forest that surrounded the castle. "The rest is up to you." I looked at her, then at the others. "What if I don't come back?" Keller hesitated, then placed a hand on my shoulder. "Then, we'll keep fighting. But you will come back. I know you will." I wasn't sure if she was trying to convince me or herself. The path to the castle was lined with grotesque statues, twisted shapes that looked like they might have once been people. Their faces were frozen in expressions of terror, and their eyes seemed to follow me as I walked. I told myself they were just stone, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. The entrance to the castle was a massive iron door, half rusted and covered in strange symbols. I pushed it open with a groan of protest, stepping into a dimly lit hallway that smelled of decay and old magic. The castle was a labyrinth of shadow and silence. Every step I took echoed unnaturally, and the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I could feel the magic Keller had warned me about, an invisible force that seemed to seep into my skin and whisper in my ears. "Turn back," it seemed to say. "You don't belong here." But I kept moving, forcing myself to focus on the task at hand. The artifact had to be here somewhere, and I wasn't leaving without it. I found it in a chamber at the heart of the castle, resting on a stone pedestal. It was smaller than I'd expected, a simple, unassuming amulet made of black metal, its surface etched with intricate runes. The moment I stepped into the room, I felt it. The power emanating from the amulet was almost tangible, a pulsing, rhythmic energy that made the air hum. I reached out to grab it, but as soon as my fingers brushed the metal, the room shifted. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows lengthening and deepening until they became a solid mass. And then I saw her, the Wicked Witch. She wasn't real, not in the flesh anyway, but her image filled the room, her green face twisted into a cruel smile. Her voice echoed around me, low and mocking. "Do you think you're any better than her?" she asked, her tone dripping with venom. "You'll take this power, and you'll use it just like she does. They all do in the end." "I'm not like her," I said, though my voice wavered. Her laughter filled the chamber, cold and hollow. "They all say that too." The shadows surged toward me, and I braced myself, clutching the amulet to my chest. The witch's voice grew louder, more insistent, until it was a deafening roar. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The shadows receded, and the room returned to its former state. I was alone again, the amulet clutched tightly in my hand. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran. By the time I made it back to the rebels, my legs were trembling, and my chest ached with every breath. But I had the amulet. Keller's face lit up when she saw it, but the scarecrow only nodded, his expression grim. "Now," he said, "the real fight begins." The scarecrow wasted no time explaining the next step. "The amulet will weaken Glinda's magic," he said, holding it up to inspect the runes etched into its surface. "But only if we can get close enough to use it. It needs to be activated within the Emerald Palace itself, right under her nose." I frowned. "How are we supposed to do that? She has an entire army guarding the place." "That's where the rebellion comes in," Keller said. "We've been preparing for this for months, waiting for the right moment to strike. With the amulet, we finally have a chance." Their plan was bold, almost recklessly so. The rebels would stage an attack on the outskirts of the Emerald City to draw Glinda's forces away from the palace. Meanwhile, a small team, including me, would infiltrate the palace and activate the amulet. "Once it's active," the Scarecrow explained, "it will disrupt her connection to the magic of Oz. She won't be able to control her enforcers or her spells. That's when we strike the final blow." "Strike the final blow?" I asked, my stomach sinking. "You mean kill her?" The Scarecrow's gaze was unyielding. "Yes, this isn't a game. Glinda won't stop unless she's stopped permanently." I wanted to argue, to suggest some other way, but I knew he was right. Glinda had built her power on lies, fear, and cruelty. There was no reasoning with someone like her. As the rebels made their final preparations, I found myself pulled aside by Keller. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice quiet. "You've already done more than anyone could have asked. If you want to leave, no one will blame you." I looked at her, at the determination in her eyes, and shook my head. "I can't leave. Not now. If we don't stop her, she'll keep destroying everything. And if there's even a chance I can help, I have to take it." She smiled, a mixture of pride and sadness. "Then let's make sure it counts." The day of the attack arrived, and the rebels moved like a storm. Their forces clashed with Glinda's enforcers on the outskirts of the Emerald City, creating chaos and confusion. From my vantage point, on a hill overlooking the city, I could see the golden streets running red with blood. While the battle raged, our infiltration team slipped into the palace. The Scarecrow led the way, his movements quick and deliberate, despite his ungainly appearance. Keller and Jack followed close behind, with me bringing up the rear. The palace was eerily quiet, its opulent halls bathed in an unnatural golden light. Every step we took echoed like a gunshot, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "This way," the Scarecrow whispered, leading us down a side corridor. We encountered surprisingly little resistance, just a few scattered enforcers, easily avoided or dispatched. It was almost too easy, and that made me nervous. When we reached the throne room, I realized why. Glinda was waiting for us. She stood at the far end of the room, her golden gown shimmering like liquid sunlight. Her smile was wide and brittle, her eyes glittering with malice. "So," she said, her voice dripping with mockery, "the prodigal child returns. And you've brought friends. How quaint." I felt my blood turn to ice as her gaze locked onto me. "Did you really think you could outsmart me?" she continued, stepping closer. "You've been a pawn in my game since the moment you set foot in Oz. Did you honestly believe you had a chance?" The Scarecrow stepped forward, holding the amulet aloft. "It's over, Glinda. Your reign ends today." She laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed through the chamber. "You think that trinket can stop me? You underestimate the power of Oz." With a flick of her wrist, the room erupted into chaos. Golden light poured from her hands, forming into razor-sharp tendrils that lashed out at us. The Scarecrow threw himself in front of me, taking the brunt of the attack. "Go!" he shouted, his voice strained. "Activate the amulet." I stumbled forward, clutching the amulet in both hands. The runes on its surface glowed faintly, responding to my touch. Glinda's magic slammed into me, a searing wave of pain that threatened to tear me apart. But I held on, focusing all my will on the amulet. "Stop him!" Glinda screamed, her voice breaking with fury. I could feel the amulet pulsing in my hands, its energy building to a crescendo. The room blurred around me, and for a moment, I thought I might black out. But then, with a final surge of power, the amulet activated. A shockwave rippled through the throne room, shattering Glinda's magic like glass. The golden tendrils dissolved, and she stumbled back, her face contorted with shock and rage. "No," she shrieked. "You can't." Before she could finish, Keller lunged forward, her dagger flashing in the dim light. Glinda's scream was cut short as the blade found its mark. The room fell silent, the only sound my own ragged breathing. Glinda's body crumpled to the floor, her golden gown pooling around her like spilled sunlight. It was over. The days that followed were a blur. The rebels declared victory, and the people of Oz began to rebuild. But the scars left by Glinda's rule wouldn't heal overnight. As for me, I didn't know what to do. I'd come to Oz twice, both times against my will, and now I felt like a stranger in both worlds. "You could stay," Keller said one evening as we stood on a hill overlooking the Emerald City. "We could use someone like you." I looked at her, at the city below, and shook my head. "This isn't my home. It never was." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Will we ever see you again?" "I don't know," I admitted. When I finally left Oz, I didn't feel the same sense of wonder or nostalgia as before. This time, I felt the weight of everything I'd seen and done. But one thing was certain. The Oz I left behind was no longer ruled by fear. And for the first time, in a long time, I felt free. It's been 2 years since I left Oz. 2 years since I stood in Glinda's throne room and saw the light leave her eyes. 2 years since I held the amulet in my hands, felt its weight, and made the choice that changed everything. I don't dream about Oz the way I used to. When I do, it's not the colorful, magical land I remember from my childhood. It's the shadowed halls of the Emerald Palace, the faces of the rebels who fought and bled for their freedom, and Glinda's voice, sharp and mocking, still echoing in my ears. At first, I thought I could put it behind me. I tried to pick up where I left off, to rebuild a life in a world that had no idea what I'd been through. But something was always off. The colors here seemed duller, the air heavier. People smiled, but it didn't feel real. Sometimes I wonder if I've changed, or if the world did while I was away. I haven't talked about Oz to anyone. How could I? Who would believe me? They'd think I'd lost my mind. Or worse, that I was lying. But it's not something you can forget, no matter how hard you try. A week ago, I found something strange in my apartment. It was small, tucked into the back of a drawer I hadn't opened in months. A single poppy petal. It was still red, as bright and fresh as the day I first saw the poppy fields outside the Emerald City. I don't know how it got there. Maybe it fell out of my pocket when I unpacked. Maybe it's been there all along, waiting for me to notice. Or maybe Oz isn't done with me yet. I keep it on my nightstand now, a reminder of the world I left behind. A reminder that somewhere out there, a land I once called magical is healing, rebuilding, and moving forward. And maybe someday, I'll find my way back.